The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Clarence House as Camilla, the queen consort, prepared for what she thought would be a routine day. She had no idea that within hours, her world would be turned upside down by a discovery that would shake the very foundations of the royal family. It all began when Camilla decided to reorganize her private study. The room had become cluttered with years of accumulated items: books, correspondence, gifts from well-wishers, and various personal belongings that had somehow found their way into corners and forgotten drawers. Spring cleaning had never been her favorite activity, but with Charles away on official duties and a rare free afternoon ahead, she felt motivated to tackle the chaos. As she worked through the afternoon, sorting items into piles of keep, donate, and discard, Camilla's attention was drawn to an ornate wooden chest that had been pushed behind her desk. The chest was beautiful, with intricate carvings and brass fittings that had aged to a warm patina. She couldn't quite remember how it had come to be in her possession, though she vaguely recalled it being among items moved from various royal residences over the years. The chest was heavier than expected, and as Camilla attempted to move it closer to the window for better light, something inside shifted with a soft metallic sound. Curious now, she examined the lock mechanism. To her surprise, the chest wasn't locked at all. The brass clasp had simply been secured with a small latch that opened easily under gentle pressure. What she found inside took her breath away. Nestled in faded silk compartments were pieces of jewelry that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Even to someone not particularly knowledgeable about precious stones, it was immediately clear that these were not ordinary pieces. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the gems flawless, and the setting spoke of a bygone era of unparalleled luxury and skill. There was a tiara that seemed to capture and reflect light from every angle, its diamonds and sapphires arranged in a pattern that was both delicate and commanding. Beside it lay a necklace of such beauty that Camilla found herself holding her breath as she lifted it carefully from its silk bed. The pearls were perfectly matched, each one lustrous and warm to the touch, connected by links of gold so fine they seemed like spun sunlight. As she continued to explore the chest's contents, Camilla discovered brooches, earrings, and bracelets, each piece more stunning than the last. Some bore inscriptions in elegant script, others were adorned with family crests that looked vaguely familiar. There were also several loose gemstones wrapped in small velvet pouches, their colors so vivid they seemed almost unreal. But it was when she found the small leather journal at the bottom of the chest that Camilla began to understand the true significance of her discovery. The journal's pages were filled with careful handwriting and faded ink, documenting each piece of jewelry with meticulous detail. Dates, occasions, provenance. Everything was recorded with the precision of someone who understood the historical importance of these items. As she read through the entries, certain names began to stand out. Queen Victoria, Queen Alexandra, Queen Mary. These weren't just any royal jewels. According to the journal, these were pieces that had belonged to some of the most significant queens in British history. The tiara, she learned, had been a wedding gift to Queen Victoria from Prince Albert. The pearl necklace had been worn by Queen Alexandra at her coronation. Camilla's hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. If the journal was accurate, she was looking at items of immeasurable historical and monetary value. These weren't just beautiful jewels. They were pieces of living history, tangible connections to the women who had shaped the monarchy over generations. The implications began to dawn on her slowly. How had these items come to be in her possession? She tried to remember when the chest had first appeared in her study, but the memory remained frustratingly elusive. Royal residences were constantly being reorganized. Items moved from storage to storage, and it wasn't uncommon for personal effects to be redistributed among family members. But these pieces, these seemed too important to have been casually redistributed. According to the journal, several of them had been specifically designated as part of the Crown Jewels collection, items that should have been in the Tower of London, or at least properly catalogued and secured within the royal collection. As afternoon faded into evening, Camilla found herself unable to look away from the treasure trove before her. She carefully photographed each piece, making notes to compare with the journal entries. The more she studied the items, the more convinced she became that these were authentic pieces of extraordinary significance. The weight of her discovery pressed down on her. What was she supposed to do with this information? How did one go about returning items to the crown jewels collection? And more importantly, how had these pieces come to be in her possession in the first place? She thought about calling Charles immediately but hesitated. He was in the middle of important diplomatic meetings, and this seemed like the kind of news that deserved a face-to-face conversation. Besides, she wanted to be absolutely certain of what she had found before raising any alarms. As night fell, Camilla carefully returned each piece to its place in the chest, but she couldn't bring herself to close the lid completely. The jewelry seemed to call to her, each piece holding secrets and stories from decades past. She found herself wondering about the women who had worn these items, their hopes, their fears, their moments of triumph and sorrow. The queen consort spent a restless night, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. By morning, she had made her decision. Whatever the consequences, whatever the explanations required, these items needed to be properly evaluated and, if necessary, returned to their rightful place in the royal collection. She had no way of knowing that her decision to do the right thing would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the royal family and her own place within it. The discovery in her study was just the beginning of a story that would test loyalties, reveal long-buried secrets, and ultimately change the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. The next morning arrived with unusual tension in the air at Clarence House. Camilla had barely slept, her mind churning over the implications of her discovery. She knew she needed expert verification before taking any further action, but the question was whom to trust with such sensitive information. After considerable thought, she decided to contact Lady Margaret Thornfield, the royal family's longtime art and antiquities consultant. Lady Margaret had served the crown for over 3 decades, her discretion absolute and her expertise unquestionable. If anyone could help navigate this delicate situation, it would be her. The phone call was brief and carefully worded. Camilla simply mentioned that she had discovered some items that required expert evaluation and would appreciate Lady Margaret's opinion. No details were shared, but something in Camilla's tone must have conveyed the urgency of the situation, because Lady Margaret agreed to visit that very afternoon. When Lady Margaret arrived at Clarence House, her usual composed demeanor seemed slightly strained. She was a woman in her 70s, silver-haired and elegant, with the kind of understated authority that came from decades of handling priceless artifacts and sensitive family matters. Camilla led her directly to the study, where the chest waited exactly as she had left it the night before. As Lady Margaret examined the first piece, the diamond and sapphire tiara, her face grew pale. She lifted her reading glasses, cleaned them carefully, and looked again. Without saying a word, she reached for the leather journal and began comparing the entries with the physical items before her. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Finally, Lady Margaret set down the tiara with hands that were not quite steady and turned to face Camilla with an expression of barely contained shock. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "where exactly did you find these items?" Camilla explained about the chest, her reorganization efforts, and her inability to remember exactly when or how the chest had come to be in her study. Lady Margaret listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. "I need to make some calls," Lady Margaret said finally. "These pieces, if they are what I believe them to be, they have been missing from the royal collection for over 15 years. There was a quiet investigation at the time, but they were never found. It was assumed they had been misplaced during one of the many relocations and reorganizations of royal property." The revelation hit Camilla like a physical blow. 15 years? She had been living with missing crown jewels in her study for who knew how long, completely unaware of their significance or the fact that they were even lost. Lady Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon documenting each piece, cross-referencing with databases and making discreet phone calls to various experts and archivists. As the day progressed, the magnitude of the discovery became increasingly clear. Not only were these pieces authentic and historically significant, but they represented some of the most important missing items from the royal collection. By evening, Lady Margaret had confirmed that they were looking at approximately 23 pieces of jewelry and loose gemstones with a combined estimated value of over £50 million. More importantly, several of the pieces had been specifically willed to the crown by previous monarchs and were legally considered inalienable property of the Monarchy. The question of how these items had ended up in Camilla's possession remained unanswered, but Lady Margaret had developed a theory. During the extensive reorganization of royal properties following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, thousands of items had been moved, catalogued, and redistributed. It was possible that someone had mistakenly included the chest among personal items being allocated to family members. However, there was another, more troubling possibility. Lady Margaret's discreet inquiries had revealed that the items had gone missing during a period when there had been significant changes in royal household staff. Several longtime employees had been let go, and new security protocols had been implemented following some minor thefts of less significant items. "The timing is suspicious," Lady Margaret confided to Camilla as they shared a quiet dinner. These pieces disappeared shortly after a major restructuring of the household staff. It's possible that someone took them with the intention of selling them gradually, but then circumstances changed before they could complete their plan. The implications were staggering. If Lady Margaret's theory was correct, it meant that someone within the royal household had attempted to steal some of the crown's most precious jewels. The chest ending up in Camilla's study might have been part of an elaborate plan to move the items gradually, or it could have been a panicked attempt to hide them when the theft was discovered. As night fell, both women found themselves grappling with the complexity of the situation. The discovery of the missing jewels was certainly cause for celebration, but the circumstances surrounding their disappearance raised serious questions about security and trust. Within the royal household, Lady Margaret made it clear that the matter could not be kept quiet much longer. Protocol required that such a significant discovery be reported to the appropriate authorities, including the Royal Collection Trust and potentially Scotland Yard. The items would need to be formally returned to the Crown, and there would likely be an investigation into how they had gone missing in the first place. For Camilla, the emotional weight of the situation was beginning to settle in. She had always tried to be a responsible steward of royal traditions and property, but now she found herself at the center of a mystery that could potentially embarrass the monarchy or worse, reveal serious security vulnerabilities. The stress of the situation was compounded by the knowledge that Charles was still away and unreachable for several more days. This was exactly the kind of crisis that required careful coordination and family consultation. But circumstances had forced her to navigate it largely alone. As Lady Margaret prepared to leave, she assured Camilla that her discretion could be absolutely counted upon. However, she also made it clear that formal reporting of the discovery could not be delayed much longer. The royal household had strict protocols for handling missing or recovered property, and failure to follow those protocols could create even greater complications. That night, Camilla sat alone in her study, looking at the chest that had turned her peaceful afternoon into the beginning of what felt like a royal crisis. The beautiful jewelry seemed to mock her with their sparkle, each piece a reminder of the questions that still needed to be answered and the difficult conversations that lay ahead. She found herself wondering about the person who had originally taken these items. Were they a trusted member of the household who had betrayed that trust? Had they acted alone, or was there a larger conspiracy? And most importantly, how many other valuable items might still be missing, their absence not yet discovered? The discovery that had initially filled her with wonder and excitement now felt like a burden of enormous responsibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult decisions, and the beginning of what was sure to be a complex process of investigation and recovery. The morning brought with it an unexpected development that would change everything. Camilla had barely finished her breakfast when she received a call from Sir Robert Fenwick, the keeper of the privy purse, requesting an immediate meeting. His voice carried an urgency that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. Sir Robert arrived within the hour, accompanied by two individuals Camilla didn't recognize: a woman in a severe navy suit who introduced herself as Inspector Davies from Scotland Yard's Art and Antiques Unit, and a younger man identified simply as Mr. Collins from the Royal Protection Command. The formal nature of their arrival made it clear that Lady Margaret's discreet inquiries had triggered an official response. The meeting took place in Camilla's private sitting room, away from the curious eyes of household staff. Sir Robert, a man known for his diplomatic approach to even the most sensitive matters, seemed unusually tense as he explained the reason for their visit. "Your Majesty," He began carefully. "We understand that you have recently discovered certain items that may be of significance to the Crown. We're here to discuss the proper procedures for handling such discoveries and to ensure that all protocols are followed correctly, Inspector." Davies took over the conversation with professional efficiency. She explained that the discovery of missing Crown property was a matter of national security and required immediate formal investigation. The items would need to be confiscated as evidence while their provenance was thoroughly examined, and the circumstances of their disappearance investigated. Camilla felt a chill run down her spine. The word confiscated made her feel like a criminal, even though she had done nothing wrong. She had found the items by accident and had immediately sought expert guidance, yet here she was being treated as though she were somehow complicit in their disappearance. Mr. Collins, speaking for the first time, added that the investigation would need to include a thorough examination of her study and private quarters. They would also need to interview her staff and review any records related to the movement of items into and out of her residences over the past several years. The implications were staggering. Camilla realized that she was not just an innocent discoverer of missing property. She was now a potential suspect in their theft. The fact that the items had been found in her private study, regardless of how they had arrived there, made her position extremely precarious. Sir Robert must have seen the distress on her face because he attempted to soften the blow. "Your Majesty, please understand that this is purely procedural. No one is suggesting any wrongdoing on your part. However, the value and significance of these items requires that we follow proper investigative protocols. The integrity of the Crown's property must be beyond question." Inspector Davies produced a series of official documents, warrants, evidence logs, and formal procedures that needed to be followed. As Camilla read through them, the reality of her situation became increasingly clear. She was about to become the subject of a criminal investigation, with all the scrutiny and potential public embarrassment that entailed. The process of cataloging and removing the items took several hours. Each piece was photographed from multiple angles, measured, weighed, and sealed in evidence bags. The chest itself was examined for fingerprints and other forensic evidence. Camilla watched in growing dismay as strangers handled items she had come to think of as treasures, reducing them to mere evidence in a criminal case. During the process, Inspector Davies asked detailed questions about Camilla's daily routines, her access to various royal properties, and her relationships with household staff. The questions were polite but pointed, and Camilla began to understand that she was being evaluated not just as a witness, but as a potential suspect. The most difficult moment came when Inspector Davies asked about Camilla's financial situation. Were there any debts or financial pressures that might have motivated someone to steal valuable items? Had she ever considered selling any royal property? The questions felt invasive and insulting, but Camilla forced herself to answer calmly and completely. As the investigators worked, word of their presence began to spread through the household. Staff members whispered in corridors, and Camilla could see the concern and confusion in their eyes. She realized that rumors would soon begin circulating, and that controlling the narrative would become increasingly difficult. Mr. Collins informed her that the investigation would likely take several weeks to complete. During that time, there would be restrictions on her movements and activities. She would need to inform his office of any travel plans, and certain areas of her residences would remain sealed until forensic examination was complete. The psychological impact of these restrictions was immediate and profound. Camilla felt like a prisoner in her own home, under suspicion for crimes she had not committed. The stress of the situation was compounded by the knowledge that Charles was still unreachable, leaving her to navigate this crisis alone. Lady Margaret arrived in the afternoon, her face grave with concern. She had been contacted by the authorities and asked to provide a formal statement about her examination of the items. The friendly consultation of the previous day had been transformed into official testimony in a criminal investigation. "I'm so sorry," Lady Margaret said quietly. "I never imagined that reporting the discovery would lead to this level of scrutiny. The authorities are treating this as a major theft case, and they seem to believe that the items may have been deliberately placed in your study as part of a larger scheme. The suggestion that Camilla might have been unknowingly used as part of someone else's criminal plan was both alarming and oddly comforting. At least it offered an alternative to the implication that she had been directly involved in the theft. As evening approached, the investigators finally completed their work and departed, leaving behind a study that felt violated and strange. The familiar comfort of her private space had been disrupted by their presence, and Camilla found herself reluctant to spend time in the room where this nightmare had begun. The silence of the house felt oppressive after the day's activity. Staff members moved quietly through their duties, uncertain how to behave in the wake of the morning's events. Camilla realized that the investigation would affect not just her, but everyone in her household. That night she attempted to reach Charles again, but his diplomatic schedule remained too demanding for personal calls. She found herself facing the most difficult crisis of her royal career entirely alone, with no clear path forward and no certainty about how the investigation might conclude. The discovery that had begun as a moment of wonder and historical excitement had transformed into a nightmare of suspicion and legal complexity. Camilla fell asleep wondering how her life had become so complicated by a simple decision to clean her study, and whether the truth about the missing jewels would ever fully emerge. The royal lifestyle that had always provided comfort and security now felt fragile and uncertain, as though everything she had built could be destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. 3 days after the confiscation, an unexpected breakthrough came from the most unlikely source. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an elderly woman who had served as head housekeeper at various royal residences for over 40 years before retiring, appeared at Clarence House requesting an urgent meeting with Camilla. Mrs. Hartwell was 83 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that still sparkled with intelligence despite her age. She walked with a cane but carried herself with the dignity that came from a lifetime of service to the crown. Camilla remembered her fondly from various royal events over the years, though they had never had extensive personal conversations. "Your Majesty," Mrs. Hartwell began once they were seated in the morning room, "I've heard through the household network about the recent troubles. I believe I may have information that could help clarify the situation." Camilla leaned forward eagerly, desperate for any information that might shed light on the mystery. Mrs. Hartwell's next words would prove to be the key that unlocked everything. "The chest you found," Mrs. Hartwell continued carefully. "I remember it well. It belonged to Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. She kept it in her private study at Windsor Castle for many years. But what you may not know is that she had been using it as a sort of emergency reserve of valuable items. The revelation was, startling." Mrs. Hartwell explained that during times of political uncertainty or potential threats to the monarchy, the Queen had quietly set aside certain valuable items that could be quickly accessed if needed. The practice had begun during World War II and had continued in modified form throughout her reign. "The Queen was always mindful of history," Mrs. Hartwell said. She remembered stories her father told her about hiding valuable items during the war, about the importance of having reserves that were not officially catalogued or stored in obvious locations. The chest contained items that were precious but could be moved quickly if circumstances required it. According to Mrs. Hartwell, the chest had been moved from Windsor Castle shortly after the Queen's death. During the extensive reorganization of her personal effects, the Queen had left specific instructions that certain personal items should be distributed among family members, but the instructions regarding the chest had been unclear or possibly misunderstood. "I believe," Mrs. Hartwell said thoughtfully, "that someone was supposed to ensure the chest's contents were properly returned to the Crown collection. But in the chaos following Her Majesty's death, those instructions were either missed or misinterpreted." This explanation transformed the entire narrative. If Mrs. Hartwell was correct, then there had been no theft at all. The items had been legitimately in the Queen's possession, albeit not formally catalogued as part of the crown jewels. Their appearance in Camilla's study was the result of administrative confusion rather than criminal activity. Mrs. Hartwell produced a small notebook from her handbag, its pages yellowed with age. "I kept careful records of everything during my years of service," she explained. "I believe this may help prove the legitimacy of the Queen's possession of those items." The notebook contained detailed entries spanning decades, documenting the movement of various items throughout royal residences. Several entries specifically mentioned the chest and its contents, including dates when items were added or removed. Most importantly, There were references to conversations with the Queen about her private reserve and her intentions for its eventual disposition. Camilla felt a mixture of relief and vindication. If Mrs. Hartwell's account was accurate, it would clear her of any suspicion and explain the mystery of the missing jewels. However, she also realized that this information needed to be presented to the authorities in the proper way to be most effective. Mrs. Hartwell agreed to provide a formal statement to the investigators, but she expressed concern about the potential implications for other household staff who might have been involved in the post-death reorganization. Many good people worked very hard during that difficult time, she said. I wouldn't want anyone to be unfairly blamed for what was essentially a misunderstanding. That afternoon, Camilla contacted Sir Robert Fenwick to share Mrs. Hartwell's revelations. Sir Robert listened carefully to her account and agreed that this new information could significantly change the investigation's direction. He arranged for Mrs. Hartwell to meet with Inspector Davies the following day. The meeting with Inspector Davies lasted several hours. Mrs. Hartwell presented her notebook and provided detailed testimony about the Queen's practices regarding valuable items. She also identified several other long-serving staff members who could corroborate her account. Inspector Davies, while remaining professionally skeptical, seemed impressed by the consistency and detail of Mrs. Hartwell's testimony. The notebook, in particular, provided documentary evidence that predated the item's disappearance by many years, making it unlikely to have been fabricated after the fact. Over the following days, investigators interviewed the additional staff members identified by Mrs. Hartwell. Their accounts largely supported her version of events, painting a picture of administrative confusion rather than criminal intent. Several people remembered the chest being moved during the post-death reorganization, but no one could recall specific instructions about its ultimate destination. The investigation also uncovered communication records from the period immediately following the Queen's death. These showed extensive correspondence about the disposition of her personal effects, including several references to items that needed special handling or discreet relocation. While the chest wasn't mentioned specifically, the pattern of communication supported Mrs. Hartwell's account of confusion about certain items. As the investigation progressed, the focus shifted from criminal activity to administrative failures. It became clear that the systems for tracking and managing royal property, while generally effective, had broken down during the emotionally charged period following the Queen's death. Inspector Davies informed Camilla that while the investigation would continue for several more weeks, she was no longer considered a suspect. The restrictions on her movements were lifted, and the sealed areas of her residence were reopened. The psychological relief was enormous. For the first time since the discovery, Camilla felt that she could breathe freely. The shadow of suspicion that had hung over her was lifting, replaced by a growing understanding of what had actually occurred. However, the situation also highlighted broader issues within the royal household's administrative systems. Sir Robert Fenwick began discussions about implementing new protocols for handling valuable items during future transitions. The goal was to prevent similar confusion while maintaining the flexibility that had allowed the Queen to manage her private reserves. Effectively, Mrs. Hartwell's intervention had not only solved the immediate mystery, but had also provided valuable historical context about the Queen's private practices. Her notebook revealed a side of the late Queen that few people had known about. Her practical approach to protecting valuable items and her careful planning for various contingencies. As the crisis began to resolve, Camilla found herself deeply grateful to Mrs. Hartwell for her courage in coming forward. The elderly woman had risked potential criticism or blame by revealing information about practices that had been kept private for decades. Her dedication to the truth and to protecting innocent people had been instrumental in resolving the situation. The discovery in Camilla's study was beginning to look less like a crisis and more like an opportunity to improve royal administrative systems while honoring the memory and wisdom of Queen Elizabeth II. Charles finally returned from his diplomatic mission on a gray Thursday morning, arriving at Clarence House to find his wife pale and exhausted from the ordeal of the past week. Camilla had been dreading this conversation, uncertain how to explain the complex situation that had unfolded in his absence. She met him in their private sitting room, where she had carefully arranged all the documentation related to the discovery and subsequent investigation. Charles listened in stunned silence as she recounted the events, from finding the chest to the arrival of the authorities to Mrs. Hartwell's crucial intervention. "You mean to tell me," Charles said slowly, his voice filled with disbelief, "that my mother had been keeping crown jewels in a private chest for decades, and no one knew about it except her household staff?" Camilla nodded, watching his face carefully for signs of anger or disappointment. Instead, she saw something unexpected, a mixture of admiration and sadness. Charles had always known his mother was practical and forward-thinking, but this revelation showed a level of strategic planning that even he hadn't fully appreciated. "It's so like her," he said finally, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Always thinking ahead, always preparing for contingencies that the rest of us never even considered. During the war, she used to tell me stories about hiding the crown jewels in various locations. I never realized she had continued that practice in her own way." The conversation continued for hours as Charles reviewed all the evidence and documentation. He was particularly interested in Mrs. Hartwell's notebook, recognizing many of the entries from his own memories of palace life over the decades. The detail and consistency of her records impressed him, as did her willingness to come forward when she realized the truth could help resolve the situation. However, Charles also expressed concern about the broader implications of the discovery. The fact that such valuable items could go missing for years without detection highlighted serious gaps in the royal household's administrative systems. As king, he felt responsible for ensuring that such confusion never occurred again. "We need to conduct a comprehensive audit," he decided. "Every item in every royal residence needs to be properly cataloged and tracked. We can't have any more surprises like this, no matter how well-intentioned the original purposes might have been." Sir Robert Fenwick was summoned to discuss the implementation of new inventory and tracking systems. The conversation revealed that similar situations might exist elsewhere. Items that had been moved or stored during various transitions over the years without proper documentation. The scope of the potential problem was much larger than anyone had initially realized. Charles also insisted on meeting with Mrs. Hartwell personally to thank her for her service and her courage in coming forward. The meeting, held at Windsor Castle, was deeply moving for all involved. Mrs. Hartwell brought additional notebooks and documents that she had kept over her decades of service, creating an invaluable historical record of palace life and practices. During their conversation, Mrs. Hartwell revealed additional details about the Queen's private practices. The chest had been just one of several methods the Queen had used to maintain flexibility in managing valuable items. There were also specific bank accounts, safety deposit boxes, and even certain trusted individuals who had been designated to hold items temporarily during various circumstances. Her Majesty was always mindful that the monarchy needed to be adaptable, Mrs. Hartwell explained. She had lived through wars, political crises, and social upheavals. She believed that sometimes the best way to protect valuable items was to keep them outside the formal systems that might be targeted or compromised. This revelation led to the discovery of several other caches of valuable items that had been maintained according to the Queen's private system. Most were properly documented in her personal records, but a few had fallen through administrative cracks similar to the situation with Camilla's chest. The investigation officially concluded 6 weeks after the initial discovery. Inspector Davies presented her final report, which cleared all royal family members and household staff of any wrongdoing. The report praised Mrs. Hartwell's integrity and recommended that her historical records be preserved as valuable documentation of royal household practices. The recovered jewels were formally returned to the Crown collection, but not before Charles made an important decision. Several of the pieces, particularly those that had been personal gifts to previous queens, were designated for use by current and future royal family members. The Queen's own notes had indicated her wish that these items continue to be worn and enjoyed rather than simply stored in vaults. Camilla was deeply moved when Charles presented her with the pearl necklace that had once belonged to Queen Alexandra. Mother's notes indicate that she specifically hoped this would be worn by future Queen's consort, he said. "I can think of no one who would honor its history more appropriately than you." The emotional weight of receiving such a significant piece was overwhelming. Camilla understood that she was not just receiving beautiful jewelry, but becoming a custodian of royal history. The necklace represented a tangible connection to the women who had served the crown before her, and a responsibility to preserve that legacy for future generations. The media, which had been carefully managed throughout the crisis, was given a limited version of events. The official statement mentioned the discovery of historically significant items during routine household organization, their proper authentication and return to the Crown collection, and the implementation of improved inventory systems. No mention was made of the investigation, the suspicions, or the emotional toll the situation had taken on those involved. Privately, however, the experience had profoundly affected everyone involved. Camilla had learned important lessons about the weight of royal responsibility and the complex history that surrounded even seemingly simple household items. Charles had gained new appreciation for his mother's strategic thinking and the challenges of managing an institution with centuries of accumulated traditions and possessions. The household staff, particularly those who had worked closely with the Queen, felt validated that their years of careful service were finally being properly recognized and documented. Mrs. Hartwell became something of a celebrity within royal circles, her knowledge and dedication earning widespread respect and admiration. The crisis had also strengthened the relationship between Charles and Camilla, as they had navigated a difficult situation together and emerged with greater understanding of their shared responsibilities. The discovery that had initially seemed like a potential disaster had ultimately become an opportunity for growth, improvement, and deeper appreciation for the institution they served. As autumn approached, life at Clarence House returned to its normal rhythms, but with important changes in place to prevent similar situations in the future. 6 months later, Camilla stood in the renovated study at Clarence House looking at the spot where the ornate chest had once sat hidden behind her desk. The room had been completely reorganized, with new security measures and inventory systems in place, but she still remembered vividly the moment her life had changed with that simple discovery. The comprehensive audit ordered by Charles had been completed, revealing dozens of valuable items throughout various royal residences that had been improperly catalogued or temporarily misplaced over the years. The total value of recovered items exceeded £200 million, making Camilla's discovery just the tip of a much larger iceberg. Mrs. Hartwell had been formally appointed as historical consultant to the royal collection, despite her advanced age. Her notebooks and memories had proven invaluable in tracking down missing items and understanding the context of various collections. She worked part-time from a comfortable office at Windsor Castle, finally receiving official recognition for knowledge she had been accumulating for decades. The new inventory system, overseen by a team of professional archivists and security experts, had revolutionized how royal property was managed. Every item worth more than £1,000 was now tagged with discrete electronic tracking devices, photographed extensively, and entered into a secure digital database. Regular audits were scheduled to ensure nothing could disappear unnoticed again. Camilla had become an unexpected advocate for the project, using her experience to help design systems that balance security with the practical needs of a living, working royal household. Her input had been particularly valuable in ensuring that the new procedures didn't interfere with the natural flow of palace life or create unnecessary burdens for staff members. The pearl necklace from Queen Alexandra had become one of Camilla's most treasured possessions. She wore it regularly to important state functions, each time feeling the weight of history and the connection to the remarkable women who had worn it before her. Several times she had caught Charles looking at her with deep emotion when she wore the necklace, both of them thinking of his mother and her careful stewardship of these precious items. The relationship between Camilla and the household staff had been strengthened by the shared experience of the investigation and its aftermath. They had seen her grace under pressure and her commitment to doing the right thing regardless of personal cost. The respect that had been building over years of service had solidified into genuine affection and loyalty. Inspector Davies had been promoted partly based on her handling of the case, which had become a model for investigating missing cultural property. Her report had been studied by law enforcement agencies around the world as an example of how to balance the need for thorough investigation with sensitivity to the cultural and historical significance of recovered items. The media attention had eventually died down, but the story had captured public imagination in unexpected ways. Several museums had launched programs to help families identify and properly preserve valuable heirlooms, inspired by the discovery at Clarence House. The story had highlighted the importance of proper documentation and the hidden treasures that might exist in homes around the country. For Camilla personally, the experience had been transformative. She had faced potential public humiliation and criminal suspicion with dignity, emerging stronger and more confident in her role. The crisis had tested her judgment, her relationships, and her commitment to royal duty, and she had passed every test. Charles often spoke privately about how proud he was of how she had handled the situation. "You could have easily panicked or tried to hide the discovery," he told her one evening as they walked through the gardens at Highgrove. "Instead, you did exactly what needed to be done, even knowing it might cause problems for you personally. That's the mark of true royal character." The study where it all began had been transformed into something of a showcase for the new inventory system. Visitors touring Clarence House were often shown the room as an example of how traditional royal life was adapting to modern security and administrative requirements. The story, carefully edited for public consumption, had become part of the official narrative about responsible stewardship of national treasures. Lady Margaret Thornfield had also benefited from the experience, her expertise and discretion earning her additional consulting contracts with museums and private collectors around the world. She often credited Camilla's decision to seek expert help immediately as the key factor that had prevented a much larger crisis. The chest itself had been returned to Camilla after the investigation concluded, though it now contained only personal papers and sentimental items. It sat in her private sitting room, a reminder of the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with such an innocent discovery. As Christmas approached, Camilla found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that spring afternoon when she had decided to clean her study. What had seemed like a simple household task had led to revelations about royal history, improvements in administrative systems, recognition for dedicated staff members, and personal growth that she could never have anticipated. The Queen Consort had learned that sometimes the most ordinary moments can lead to extraordinary consequences. Her decision to organize her study had uncovered not just missing treasures, but hidden stories about the monarchy's adaptability and the dedication of those who serve it. The experience had also taught her about the weight of royal responsibility, how every decision, every action, every discovery carried implications far beyond what was immediately visible. She had learned to navigate complex situations with grace while maintaining her commitment to truth and transparency. On a cold December evening, as she sat in her renovated study reviewing correspondence, Camilla's attention was drawn to a small wooden box on her desk, a recent gift from Charles containing letters from Queen Elizabeth II that had been found during the audit. As she opened the box and began reading the carefully preserved letters, she realized that her story was just one chapter in the ongoing narrative of royal service and dedication. The discovery of the chest had ended, but the lessons it taught about history, responsibility, and integrity would continue to guide her for the rest of her life. She had found more than missing jewels in that ornate chest. She had found a deeper understanding of her role and her connection to the centuries of tradition she was now helping to preserve and protect.